at Gloucester Police Station. The date is the 14th of December 1992. This is an interview under caution with Bishop Peter Ball. Do you remember the first time you met with Neil Todd?
No comment.
Do you remember how old Neil was?
No comment.
Neil has told me that you said to become a monk, he needed to pray with you naked and take cold showers.
You wouldn't understand.
It was so evil. I remember curling up in a ball under my duvet, just wishing and praying that I could die.
I felt under constant threat of having to agree to these things that I didn't want to agree to.
I thought it was only me. And I know that sounds crazy now. And I remember distinctly thinking, I've really got to do something about this.
The people at the top are really powerful people. The Peter Ball case is the tip of an iceberg.
As far as the records held by the church, I thought I had seen everything. And how naive was that?
I hadn't appreciated the level of deception. And then I thought, you bastard, you know. How can you be so devious?
It showed how rotten and corrupt and even evil the pervading culture and leadership of the Church of England is.
We're headed to Litlington, where Peter's, the first house was as Bishop of Lewis, where the scheme was mainly held. This is where the heyday of the scheme was. When he lived in Litlington, that's when he had dozens and dozens of young men staying at the house. When I first came to the house, I was 17. I came for the interviews. And then when I moved in, I was just turned 18. I don't think I've been back for 27 years. Yeah, I do feel anxious.
When I became Bishop of Lewis in 1977, I wanted not to live as perhaps bishops should and do on the whole. I wanted to go on living the monastic life.
Peter Ball was unusual. He seemed to be marked out as a rising star by those in the upper echelons of the church. In 1980, he set up the Give a Year to God scheme, attracting young men into the monastic life. Of course, as a bishop, he had free rein in his particular part of the world and was essentially unchallengeable.
The young come, They agree that for a year they'll live very simply. I roll them out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning. They come down to an hour in the dark, alone with God.
I moved into Peter's house and I stayed there for a year. I didn't know what to expect. I'd heard that he was a very spiritual figure, that he was a monk and a bishop, but I didn't know anything else. When I turned up on his doorstep, I was ripe for in terms of seeking a father figure, full of self-hatred, having always felt like the outsider, having wanted to live a special life in that I wanted to help others, I wanted to live a meaningful life. And Peter offered all of those things and made me feel incredibly lucky, but incredibly chosen as well.
Can I say thank you for somebody made my bed last night, which was nice of them. Well, it's horrible to come back and find your bed unmade and have to make it up. I mean, that's, as you know, what life's about. Making beds.
As an adolescent, I'd felt the outsider. And here was somebody who recognised something in me, Bishop Peter. He'd look into your eyes and his voice would go high and he would make you believe that you were somebody incredibly special. And of course, at that age, when you're searching for your own identity and struggling with various issues, that's exactly what you want to hear. That's exactly what I wanted to hear.
Peter Ball was an active socialite. He had spent years ingratiating himself with members of the establishment. He had cultivated a friendship with Margaret Thatcher.
The MP for Sussex was a good friend of his. He would often bring up how he was going around for dinner with him.
Lord Lloyd of Berwick. Tim Renton, MP, who was the chief whip in John Major's government.
He said how well he got on with the Queen Mother as well.
He went round to Highgrove to say prayers with Prince Charles. They exchanged letters. Peter Ball became Charles Windsor's friend. He courted people in public office.
Peter kept mentioning his friendship with Prince Charles in a flippant, as anyone would talk about their friend, but he's talking about Prince Charles. Here he was 1 minute having a friendship with somebody as low down as me. Next minute he's dropping into the conversation. Oh, he's a counsellor to royalty. It just reinforced his specialness and the idea that he's impregnable.
Okay. Right. This is of me in my final year at school in London. I was a boarder. That's me there. And that was very much in the middle of the time of my associations with Bishop Peter Ball. My family was living in Eastbourne, which was the area where he was bishop. Everyone I knew said this man was a living saint. So everyone felt that they were in the presence of someone who was generous and kind and deeply holy. I was a naive teenager seeking to explore a vocation to be ordained. To be honest with you, I don't remember the first time I met Bishop Peter Ball. All I remember is the occasions when he tried to take my clothes off me. To begin with, nothing happened. It was just simply praying with him. But soon, the sexual advances started. I do remember Bishop Peter Ball making me feel as if somehow I owed it to him and to God to take all my clothes off and be naked with him. And when I say be naked with him, that he wanted to take his clothes off too. I remember as a teenage boy being completely confused by what he was trying to do, feeling extraordinarily uncomfortable.
It was a process of grooming, it was a process of preparing me step by step. And gradually, as the conversations moved on from having a cold shower in front of him to other things he suggested I should do that he had done with other holy people, I would not be as good as those other holy people. I wouldn't be as special, I wouldn't be as Christ-like if I didn't do those things. And when I let him down, or when I didn't want to engage with some of the things he was later suggesting, he would rub his bald head and say, gosh, it's never mind, you know, I thought that Christ had chosen you for a very special reason. But if you're not up for it, don't worry, you know, it's only very few people are chosen for the holy life to be Christ-like. Don't worry about it. And of course, by saying that, he made me feel incredibly guilty that I'd let down not just him, but God. So I would do everything to try and make it up for him. He said, what would you like to do to overcome the temptation of your desires? And over time, this conversation kept coming up and then disappearing, coming up again over the first few weeks. So I said, I don't know, what do you suggest? So he said, for this one time, we'll hug naked, because it was part of the humiliation, the wearing away of one's pride and one's ego and one's reservations. That involved being in his room and stripping naked and kneeling down, and then he hugged me. And I just waited for this ordeal to be over. I was incredibly uncomfortable. I'd never been naked in front of anyone before, apart from him, and I'd certainly never touched anyone before.
Crowds greeted Gloucester Cathedral's most exalted parishioner, Prince of Wales. It's believed to be the first time the Prince has watched an enthronement ceremony.
He had previously applied to become Bishop of Norwich, but he was rebuffed from that application because he was told that Norwich would not tolerate a bishop having these adolescent boys in his house. Subsequently, he was able to use his political connections to encourage 10 Downing Street, who were the people who made the decision, to appoint him as the Bishop of Gloucester.
Bishop Peter came, and things quite dramatically changed, you know. We explained that we were living in a flat adjoining. I got the impression that he wanted his privacy and wasn't very keen on the idea that we were his nearest neighbours.
Peter Ball was really arrogant, and I thought monks were very humble people.
And we were quite surprised because he was very vain, actually. And there were a lot of young boys coming and going. He did like the company of younger people.
Neil said that he had a calling for the church. He wanted to help people as in many ways as he could, and he thought this was the way of doing it. He'd written away to the church and asked if he could become a novice, and they wrote back and said that he could join the church and they'd be quite happy to have him. So if he popped down to Gloucester,
he was a very nice boy, very quiet, good-looking boy. He was lovely. Him and I got on really well, and he used to come up to the flat for a cup of tea sometimes.
He was timid young man. I can understand him being timid, really. He was only 17, and he was a very young 17, not like 17-year-olds nowadays.
Very vulnerable young boy. And he used to suffer with homesickness as well. He used to be quite homesick.
The relationship that I saw between Peter Ball and Neil was one of fear. He treated him like a slave, as if he was his slave. And he was in fear of him, definitely in fear of him.
He knocked on the door of the flat one evening, and I said, come into the lounge, and we started to chat, and he got very agitated. So I sat him down, and I said, look, you've got to tell me something. What is it about?
When Neil started to tell this story, I couldn't believe it. He was telling us that he had to take part in a final ceremony. Well, the final initiation ceremony involved being whipped and struck with a whip of some sort.
I said, you are going to be whipped by the bishop. And he said, yes. And I said, have you done other things that you've been made to do? And he said, yes. I don't know what I thought, really. I just thought, you know, it was a shocking thing. Certainly wasn't a Christian thing to do. He was crying and upset, and he was just beside himself. Well, he was just so terrified of what was going to happen. I said, well, I could call the police in. And he said, oh, no, don't, please don't do that. Don't call the police. We were stuck in this awful position, you see, nobody else knew, only us. That was when we decided that we would have to go up and see Bishop John.
We decided the only person we could tell was Bishop John Yates, because he was the only close person we knew who was in higher authority. When we went to see John, we told him exactly what had been happening.
So Bishop John said to me, well, what do you expect me to do? And I said, well, it's a funny question to ask, really. I said, well, just to put a stop to all this going on. I said, you know, something's got to be done.
John Yates did say that he would contact Jeremy Walsh, the Bishop of Tewkesbury, but he hadn't.
So we went to tell Bishop Jeremy. He knew nothing about it at all. Nothing at all. And that was it. He didn't know anything about it until we told him. We told people and just nothing's happening. We just felt utterly sort of lost.
I think Neil Todd was an extremely brave young man. He gave himself over to Peter Ball and his organisation completely. For him to complain about his bishop, his mentor, he didn't know whether Mr. and Mrs. Moss would believe him. He turned his back on Ball. Yeah, he was an extremely brave young man.
I was working in the garden one day and I felt somebody behind me. And he used to creep around like a ghost in his monk's habit and the cowl thing pulled over his head. And suddenly his arms came round my shoulders and he said to me, "You did what you thought best for Neil, but we've got to go through this together. Well, I couldn't say a word. I was standing there and he put his arm round me like that. I thought, you bastard. And I just ignored him and walked away. And I was so annoyed, really annoyed. It's a wonder I didn't hit him.
I got a phone call from Neil. He was crying, really distraught. He couldn't say what was wrong. I says, "Where are you?" and one thing and another. And I just couldn't get him to calm down. So what happened then, we just says, "Right, where are you? We're coming to get you." And it wasn't till we went down there to pick him up that we'd been told he'd been in the hospital for 5 days with an overdose. The church never let us know at any time that he'd been in hospital. We never found out till we actually went to pick him up. He was just sobbing and crying all the way home, and all he kept saying was, "I'm very, very sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And we said, "You've nothing to be sorry about, just let us know what's happening." And he still wouldn't discuss it with me and his mother. It's terrible, yeah, because you don't know how to help in any way. All you want to do for your kids is just love them and keep them safe. And you think if they're going to the church, that there's no other safer place that they can be, especially with this supposed to be this great bishop. Back in London, they were saying, the church is going to deal with this. The church is going to deal with this. And then something come out about, I says, "Well, no, the church isn't going to deal with this." I says, "I'm going to get the police in straight away."
I remember it was a little bit quiet, and then somebody said to me, "Boss, we're going to get you a cup of coffee, and then when you're finished, we're going to hit you with something." So I was handed this incident report, and somewhat shocked and surprised to see that it related to the Bishop of Gloucester, an allegation by, as it turned out, Neil Todd, that he'd been indecently assaulted by Peter Ball. Now, back in 1992, it was really unheard of that such a complaint should be made against someone so high in the church. This was pretty big stuff. So I knew that the priority was to meet Neil Todd and to get the investigation underway.
Bishop Peter introduced me to penitential psalms. He told me that I would have to be obedient and that I would have to give it my all.
Go on.
He told me that the penitential psalms were performed naked. I felt quite lost in my own mind. He said this was done by the other brothers and that he was the bishop, so it must be all right. I didn't have a chance to respond. Then he unclothed himself.
What did you do?
I left my underwear on. But Bishop Peter insisted that we must feel the cold.
Peter would rub his head and say, what can we do to really enter into the suffering of Christ? What can you think of? Something so disgusting, so humiliating, that gosh, I can't think. Can you think? And I would say, no, because I knew he had something in his mind that he was going to suggest that I didn't want to hear what it was. And then he would say, gosh, I don't know, even perhaps, I don't know, masturbating each other, something so disgusting that you feel really humiliated, and to really enter into the suffering of Christ. Suffering is very essential to the redemption presented by Christianity. And Peter's justification why we had to suffer was to be Christ-like. Christ suffered. The symbol of Christianity is the crucifix, which is a symbol of torture. So it was very hard to argue against that.
Bishop Peter seemed to want me to be more obedient to himself than to God. And I wanted to leave. I told him I was going to start at a silent monastery.
What did he say?
He gave me his blessing. And then he said that night that I was going to have to go round to his room. It would be our last chance, our last opportunity to be open with each other. He wanted to express his love. I felt frightened.
Did you go?
He came to my room. He said to me, "You don't want this." The way he said it, it just made me feel guilty, as if it was wrong to say no. And I'd never said no to Bishop Peter Ball in the entire time I'd known him. I wanted to so many times, but I feared him.
What happened next?
He kept using this term, sharing. That we were gonna share ourselves. I had no idea what he meant.
For Neil, no way was it easy. You had that feeling that you know, this young man wasn't lying. He was telling us the truth. So we were then in a position, or I felt we were in a position, to arrest the bishop.
It's for you.
Yes, sir, yes. Well, please let the Archbishop know that I've started my inquiries.
It's not every day the Metropolitan Police get a telephone call from the Archbishop of Canterbury. They now knew that the matter had been reported to the police.
It's extraordinary that on the very first day of police involvement, the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, the head of the Anglican Church, rings the head of the Met Police, who in turn rings the head of Gloucestershire Police to find out something about the investigation. This can only be the establishment working out, firstly, what's happening, what could happen, and working out ways to stifle it.
I remember Mrs. Todd saying to me, "I'm worried there's going to be a cover-up by the church." I said to her, "Well, I can tell you one thing, Mrs. Todd, there will not be a cover-up by the police." I can remember sitting in my office and looking out into the corridor and seeing uniformed superintendents lined up outside, and the Detective Chief Inspector had been assigned to arrest the bishop. You didn't get that for any other prisoner. You know, we'd never arrested a bishop before.
This interview is being tape recorded. We're at Gloucester Police Station. The date is the 14th of December 1992. This is an interview under caution with Bishop Peter Ball.
I'm going to exercise my right to silence. Thank you.
Very good. But I am still going to put my questions to you. Do you remember the first time you met with Neil Todd?
No comment.
Do you remember how old Neil was?
No comment.
Neil has told me that you said to become a monk. he needed to pray with you naked and take cold showers?
No comment.
Well, did Neil not take cold showers?
Yes, he took cold showers.
And did you watch him?
You wouldn't understand.
Neil told me you took his underwear off. And I'm reading from his statement. He pulled them down from the sides using both hands, and I stepped out of them as a child would.
Oh, dear me. No. No.
The bishop was just denying it. He would make some admissions, general admissions, if you like, about showering, but he would deny all the bits that might suggest that there was elements of indecent assault or indecency.
Neil said he came to tell you that he wanted to join a silent monastery. Just looking at my notes, he mentioned Crawley Down. Do you recollect this conversation?
Well, he fantasized about the whole religious life. And I would want to say that, yes, I did talk to him about where some of the other brothers had gone, and he wanted to go further. It was always he who urged me, give me more, give me more.
O'Neill has alleged that you told him he should be beaten with a stick or a whip.
I have some sort of feeling that I've become a father figure with him. And some of what I see as fantasy is working out his anger against his parents on me. This is fantasy stuff.
You say a father figure.
He was beaten so often at home that he came to see that as punishment for disobedience.
Did you intend to beat him?
I swear over God, I never intended to beat him.
What the bishop did was say that it was at the instigation of Todd. He did try and shift the blame to Neil's parents, which was, there was absolutely no evidence whatsoever from Neil, from his parents, that this was the case. And to be perfectly frank with you, that was wicked. But you had this thing with the bishop. He sat there and he's convincing you, look, basically, look, I wouldn't lie because I'm a bishop, and he's challenging you. Who do you believe? Who's going to be believed, me or Neil Todd?
I'd really only told a handful of people, if that, about what Peter Ball did to me. And so I had no idea that he did it to anybody else. They have so much power. Peter Ball, on the final occasion that he tried to strip me naked, made it very clear, and he was really quite cross with me, that if I didn't take all my clothes off, then he would ensure I would never be ordained. But something was just telling me I could not go through with what it was that Bishop Peter Ball wanted me to do. And he was right, he stopped it. When I presented myself for ordination, I was firmly rejected. And the chaplain of my college at Durham looked into it for me. He was a kind and generous man. And he said, Graham, there's no way they'll ordain you. There is just this huge black mark against you. It was extremely difficult for me. This is something that I had been longing for throughout my teenage years. So I had to move to New Zealand, and within 3 years, I was ordained. And then back to Wales, and unfortunately, Peter Ball's friends, many of whom are still serving bishops, have sought in every way possible to try to ensure that I didn't continue being a clergyman now. I was told that I was a troublemaker by the diocese, I feel a lot safer now I'm in Ireland, away from them. But it's rather sad that I felt that I had to leave the Church of England because I wasn't safe.
One of the things he got pleasure from was seeing my resistance break down and agree to things that I did not want to agree to. And because I felt so ashamed and guilty, I agreed to be beaten. And it was done ceremonially. It was in the evening. He asked me to strip off, and he stripped off. It was really, really painful. He said that he would hit me 10 times, and he really went for it. There was one occasion where I think after the 5th or the 6th strike, I just fell over because it was just so painful. And the first time when it was over, he offered to rub something into my backside. I don't know what, some cream. And I said, no, I'll do it. But he said, no, let me do it. And then afterwards, I remember strange, and it stood out for me. He said, now let's have a hug. We were still naked. Now let's have a hug to take away the sexual aspect of it, which at the time, would set alarm bells ringing for anyone, because there was no sexual aspect to it at all. For me, I couldn't see how it'd be for anyone.
Time is now 23:03 by my watch. This is the 3rd interview with you tonight, and I must remind you that you are still under caution. Neil alleges that you came to his room and you hugged him.
I might have hugged him, yes.
Whilst naked?
Yes. Naked before God. And I avoided all genital contact with him.
Did you stroke him?
No. I deny that. I deny stroking and all the rest of it.
Neil says you touched and stroked him whilst you were naked.
That's 9/10 fantasy. We sat together like a father and child.
Did you masturbate, Neil?
No.
He states you took hold of his penis.
I would deny completely his allegation of masturbation. Totally and utterly.
He alleges you said to him, do anything to me.
I deny that. I deny that we had any genital contact at all.
Did you ejaculate?
No, that I don't know. No, I mean, really, I don't know. Because I'm very... I've only got to have slight body contact, and I might make an admission. But I was very, 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 very careful indeed that we should not get near each other's genitals.
What we were being told was quite shocking in the sense of this was a bishop. This touching, caressing, masturbation. But what happened? We released the bishop at around midnight, and by the time the morning had come, the media were aware that the bishop had been arrested.
Allegations of indecent behaviour have apparently been made by one person. The bishop has given a statement to the police, and he has been released on police bail pending further inquiries as to whether there is a case to answer. It must be emphasised that no charges have been brought against the bishop, and the allegations made about him are unsubstantiated. Moreover, the bishop has a proven record of outstanding pastoral work, particularly amongst young people.
I think the first thing we need to do is to pray for Bishop Peter and for his family and his friends. We look forward to the time when Bishop Peter will be able to be back with us, working amongst us again.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, summoned Peter Ball to Lambeth Palace to explain what was happening. It appears that Peter Ball admitted to sexual activity with Neil Todd. So George Carey was squarely told that this had been happening.
On the 15th of December, Bishop Peter came into my room. He sat slumped on a sofa. Said, "I've been such a fool." He accepted that he had had a close relationship with Neil Todd, but he denied that he had touched him sexually in any non-consensual way. He did not go further into any detail, and I did not press him for more information, except I wanted to know if penetrative sex had taken place. I was assured not.
The press has broken, and almost immediately these letters start coming in. Some of them are from parents of adolescent boys who had been sexually assaulted by Peter Ball.
Dear Archbishop, my own son participated in Bishop Peter's scheme for youth and was approached by the bishop on a number of occasions with unwelcome suggestions. Your Grace, this is to let you know that when I was a 17-year-old schoolboy, Peter Ball, during the course of a counselling exercise for people who did not want to go to the school chaplain, asked me to masturbate in front of him. He did subtly imply that I could do anything if it helped me, or words to that effect. I believe this to mean genital contact.
George Carey had those letters of complaints in his hand. At what point do you think, wait a minute, there are so many accusations here?
But what the Archbishop did with those 6 letters is extraordinary.
One of the lines of inquiry we followed was to go to Lambeth Palace. It had been prearranged that we would go there with a view to collecting any letters that they'd received in relation to the Bishop Peter Ball, following the publicity that had been given to it. I've met Bishop John Yates, who was, if you like, the assistant to Carey, and by chance had actually been the Bishop of Gloucester before Peter Ball.
Yates hands over documentation which supports Ball, but he doesn't hand over any of the letters that complain about Peter Ball.
It wasn't for the Archbishop of Canterbury, Mr. Carey, to decide what was relevant, what wasn't. It was for us. You don't expect that the church, of all the organisations in this land, that they are actually going to withhold, and deliberately withhold, information from the police.
And in fact, George Carey, in the next room at the same time as this meeting is going on, is reading and responding to at least 2 of these complaint letters about Peter Ball.
Thank you very much for your moving, frank, and somewhat shocking letter. As the police are taking great pains to investigate the young man's allegations, I cannot comment on the contents of your letter except to say that it appears to have similar details that are most worrying. I can assure you, however, that I do not intend to allow any cover-up.
That seems to me a shocking cover-up. It's a blatant and obvious and intentioned cover-up of the truth.
A personal message from the Archbishop of Canterbury. At my request, Bishop Peter has gone away to rest while the police investigate the accusation. It's clear to me that he was under great strain. We hope and pray that the investigation will clear his name and that Bishop Peter will return to his great work of Christian ministry. Bishop Peter has always been unstinting in his service to Christ.
So, not content with burying the complaint letters and keeping them from the police, Lambeth Palace set about a multi-pronged approach. They use their influence to find out what's going on with the police investigation.
I haven't seen this for years. This is very early photographs. What's in here's Beacon House. There's me in Peter's office, a very young me. This one's of a young guy who I think he was there for 4 or 5 months. This was another guy who came to stay for a couple of weeks, I think. And there's another young guy who came and stayed for a day or two. So many young men stayed for a day or 2 days or a week or 2 weeks while I was there. Dozens. So Peter had access to a lot of people, and so it does make me think what happened to them. There was a lot of dark and fearful things happening, and the threat of more dark and terrible things happening, always hanging over.
I decided to leave Peter's and to go and move to Cambridge. I was living with the chaplain at Jesus College. Before the police came, there were many phone calls. Peter would telephone and just check that I wasn't speaking to the police. And of course, I didn't want to speak to him during that process, so the chaplain was like my defender and answering the phone. Another bishop telephoned as well and put pressure on her, implied that she should do what her bishops in the hierarchy of the church told her. She received another letter. It just felt that there was a huge amount of pressure outside the house.
As we started to widen our investigations, we found a lot of other witnesses who all spoke about masturbation, voyeurism, and we were finding people who were making allegations against the bishop, who were supporting Neil Todd.
When the police came, I wanted to make a statement in corroboration of what Neil had suffered. I told the police basically everything. I felt the need for Neil's truth to be heard and believed.
As you know, Bishop Peter Ball, you have been rearrested on suspicion of indecent assault with Neil Todd, and we have a number of new allegations from other young men.
No comment.
I put it to you, Bishop Peter, that during our previous interviews, back on the 14th of December, you were lying.
No comment.
We have new allegations of masturbation from young people under the age of consent, and new allegations of multiple beatings. Can I remind you that when I asked you about your intentions with Neil, you told me on tape, "I swear before God I would not beat him." That's a lie, isn't it?
No comment.
When you're sat there and you're interviewing and you're watching and observing, I have this picture of this man sat in a corner of a room squirming. By this time, you know that the original interview where Peter Ball gave us his explanations and tried to push the blame back onto Neil Todd, a man was lying. Now, if you think about it, you shouldn't be saying that to a bishop, but there was a man who clearly had lied through his teeth. I remember, during the course of the investigation, there was this flood of letters coming in from members of Parliament. The House of Commons headed letters, the head teachers from private schools, and you name it, they were coming in.
Back then, this is how it worked. If you were in the establishment, you could count on others of the establishment to defend you against individuals on the outside. Mere mortals, ordinaries.
At one point, I had this message come through from the CID office. You got to be here at 3 o'clock because you're getting a phone call from Lord Lloyd. I was embarrassed for him, and I'm thinking, this is a man who sits in appeal courts, and he's ringing me. It was sort of, well, what are we going to do sort of thing about the bishop? No way should he be talking to me about the bishop. I mean, there's an element of desperation that a man of this standing should be even contacting me. You look at the letters that we got, there had to be some degree of attempting to influence the investigation. And I suppose if you look at it, Peter Ball was well connected. You can't argue that perhaps it was the establishment trying to stick up for one of their own.
Dear Chief Constable, I have known the bishop for some 10 years or so. He's well known for his wholehearted commitment to his Lord and to the Christian Church. It came as a terrible shock to me when I learned that an investigation was underway into allegations of indecent behavior with an adolescent. It is quite unrepresentative of his style. Special pleading would be entirely inappropriate. At the same time, as Bishop Peter's provincial and therefore his pastor, I believe I am justified in drawing your attention to the excruciating pain and spiritual torment which these allegations have inevitably brought upon a man in his exposed position and with his sensibilities.
They had so much evidence against this man. They said to us, more or less, they have definitely got conviction. So then we were saying, okay, we're getting a result out of this, then something's going to happen. But then we got a phone call off the detective, and they said, we're very sorry, but Peter Ball is just going to get a caution.
One incident, however bad it may be, doesn't undo or negate a lifetime's ministry, and we must build on all the good and happy memories we have of Bishop Peter. He's done a tremendous amount of good, and this one incident doesn't undo all of that.
Well, at that time I sort of exploded, because hearing a caution, which is absolutely rubbish to what he should have got, that was it, and it was just threw away, it was covered up.
You look back and you think, what role did all these people play, supporting Peter Ball? What about Neil? What about the other victims? And that sticks in my throat, actually.
The church shunned Neil after he'd made the statements. So that made him really distraught as well. And that really taken toll on. He couldn't really accept what they were saying. He couldn't believe how they would just turn their back on him. He just felt that all the people that he looked up to were blatantly calling him a liar.
This is an interview under caution with Bishop Peter Ball. Neil alleges that you came to his room and you hugged him.
I might have hugged him, yes.
Whilst naked?
Yes. Naked before God.
Neil said that he had a calling for the church. And you think if they're going to the church, there's no other safer place, especially with this supposed to be this great bishop.
Bishop Peter seemed to want me to be more obedient to himself than to God.
Neil Todd was an extremely brave young man. For him to complain about his bishop, his mentor...
Well, please let the Archbishop know that I've started my inquiries.
Letters start coming in from parents of adolescent boys who had been sexually assaulted by Peter Ball.
That was it, and it was just thrown away, it was covered up.
I was concerned that police had identified a potential link between Peter Ball and serious members of the clergy.
These documents, they were discovered in a filing cabinet which was called the Naughty Boys Cabinet.
Peter Ball, I'm arresting you on multiple offences of indecent assault.
It finally seems that the storms are gathering around Peter Ball.
There was a real concern amongst victims and witnesses that there would be some form of establishment cover-up.
I hadn't appreciated the level of deception. And then I thought, you bastard.
The Right Reverend Peter Ball has resigned after being formally cautioned by the police over an allegation of gross indecency with a 17-year-old novice monk. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey, said the resignation caused him great sorrow.
In 1993, Archbishop George Carey, the head of the Anglican Church, lives at Lambeth Palace. He was the decision maker, he was the boss at Lambeth. Now, there is something known as the Lambeth List, and it's a list of individuals who are barred from having permission to officiate at ceremonies. So it prevents them from being in positions of influence. Now, George Carey knew what had happened, but decided not to put Peter Ball on the Lambeth List. We know that predators, such as Peter Ball, don't change their ways. They don't stop once they are caught. They will continue unless they are challenged and prevented from doing so.
Neil just loved the church. He got great satisfaction of being there and helping other people, and he just loved it. So after everything had come out, Neil was distraught because everybody that was in the church that he looked up to and everything else started calling him a liar. So, yeah. I don't understand how anybody could be friends with him, or I'd feel just so let down, angry. Why are they still supporting this man? It just doesn't make sense to me. But apparently he was quite a friend of Prince Charles.
During the early 90s, before the caution, the two of them were relatively close. Prince Charles attended his enthronement. After the caution, the two of them spent time in private services at Prince Charles's Highgrove house and used his private chapel for those services. Peter Ball and Prince Charles exchanged letters.
I feel so desperately strongly about the monstrous wrongs that have been done to you and the way you have been treated.
The subject of Peter Ball's return to ministry is discussed between Prince Charles and the Archbishop of Canterbury.
I saw the Archbishop the other day and he told me he's trying to bring you back to a public ministry. I do hope this will be all right and suit you if and when it happens.
Prince Charles and Peter Ball were still always in contact and still writing. Well, you think a man of Prince Charles's stature, why would you support somebody like that? If there was somebody in this village that was like that, he'd be shunned. So I don't understand why they can support him.
I pray that the Duchy will be able to find something suitable for you both in due course, but it may take a little time to locate it. I long to see you both settled somewhere that suits you and gives you peace and tranquility. And not too far from here, so you can come over more easily.
We know that Prince Charles has facilitated the provision of a house to Peter Ball.
Your house has been bought successfully. It looks rather nice, and I only hope the rent won't be too bad.
Prince Charles's wedding with Camilla, and then Camilla's father died, and then he done the reading at the funeral. So he's still getting supported in everything that he does.
I can't bear it that the frightful, terrifying man is on the loose again and doing his worst. I was visiting the vicar, and he then told me that he'd heard that this ghastly man was up to his dastardly tricks again. I'll see off this horrid man if he tries anything again.
The letter from Prince Charles to Peter, it's like the language of a gangster. Don't worry, I'll see him off. You know, you're one of the gang, you're one of us. I think the class element is really important. How dare somebody like Neil question their privilege? No matter that terrible things have been committed, it is more terrible for them that they would be criticised, that one of their own would be held accountable. It's mind-boggling how their instinctive reaction was to protect Peter.
The church shunned Neil after he'd made the statements. So that's why after that he decided to go into nursing, because that's another way he could help people. And then decided he was going to move away and make a fresh start, a new life in New Zealand, then Australia.
In 2004, I saw the advertisement for the safeguarding officer for the Diocese of Bath and Wells, and I thought that I might be able to contribute something. So I went for the interview and got the job. It was the first time that somebody had been formally put in that post. There was a lot of hostility and defensiveness at the local level and, as I later discovered, in the hierarchy of the church. The church wanted to be seen to be doing safeguarding, but they didn't really want to know about safeguarding. There was a reluctance to look at anything to do with what one might call the shadow side of the church. And I felt that the work I was doing, it was like the rather grubby little secret that the church was trying to keep at bay. So in 2006, there was a situation with a vicar in the diocese who had been harassing an adolescent boy, and he was given a warning by the police. It became clear that there needed to be a written agreement in place so that he wouldn't have further contact with this young man nor with other young people in the parish. And eventually I got a letter back saying that this particular clergyman had been in touch with Peter Ball, a friend and supporter of his, who had expressed disquiet about the written agreement. So we agreed to have a meeting. Peter Ball came with the vicar and we went through what the written agreement would mean. Peter Ball said that this had to be taken away and looked again, and he recommended that his friend did not sign it. He was actively discouraging his friend from cooperating with the diocese. People found it very, very difficult to understand when a clergyman was involved in an allegation. And I remember on 2 or 3 occasions, I was really trying not to cry, because one of the things I was accused of was being like the Pharisees who crucified Jesus. It was so hostile. I was amazed at how hostile people could be in the church when it was supposed to be about loving one another. I didn't know anything about Peter Ball. I didn't know about his past. I don't know how much he was up to in terms of sexual gratification, but I do think he was up to manipulating and manoeuvring people to suit his issues of power and control and his deviousness.
When I was 9 years old, Roy Cotton came along and became the priest in charge. The whole sort of grooming process started from when I very first met him, so when I was about 9 years old. And it continued up until I was 18, 19 years old, so it's kind of a decade he dominated my life, which when you're a child is your whole life. Roy Cotton would buy me gifts, but they were very academic things. He'd buy me books about architecture and history and art, but then would only give you these gifts or talk to you about them if you went into the bedroom and it was all done on the bed. It was just a way of accelerating what he wanted to do, really. But to the outside observer, it was educational and caring and a way of helping, you know, kids from a deprived background. Over many years, Cotton's immediate superior in the church was Bishop Peter Ball. So we're heading up to St Andrew's Church. Attached to that is a primary school. I attended the school on that site, and that's the first time I was really introduced to that church. This is the church that I used to go to, and the vicarage where an awful lot of it occurred. It's like revisiting the scene of a death or something, you know. When I was a kid, I thought it was only me. And I know that sounds crazy now, but I had no concept of the fact that he could be doing this to other people. I'd been helping out because I was recruited into the vicarage or the whatever to help out with anything. It was any excuse for me to be there, really. And Cotton would come and pick me up in his car and drop me off, and then it would be really late, so I'd have to stay over. So I was helping out at this confirmation class. Peter Ball had come along to that class because they were having a rehearsal. And once all the confirmation candidates had gone home, and I was the only other person there, they cracked open a bottle of wine, sat down. Peter Ball was just sitting on a chair, and Cotton was opposite, the other side of the coffee table. And as I walked round, Peter just put his arm around my midriff like this and just pulled me onto his lap. They were talking about a problem that they'd both had. It was something to do with blood vessels in your legs, and it was a thrombosis or something like that. And Peter put his hand on my knee, and as he was talking, he was sort of talking about the thing. But as he did it, he just gradually, as sitting full eye contact with Roy Cotton, and it was literally without breaking eye contact, he just put his hand up and just rested it on my groin. And he didn't do anything, there was no overt, but, you know, I was sitting on his lap and he was sexually aroused. And in that moment, I knew that Peter Ball wasn't, and I knew that he knew Cotton was too. And that was terrifying. I mean, it was truly terrifying. The other thing it did is it took away any power I had to do anything about it, because Peter was this revered figure, this saintly figure. But not only that, he was Roy Cotton's boss. He was his line manager in the church. And so at this point, and the simple fact that this was so systematic by this stage, I just thought everyone in the church knew about this. Everyone in the church was like this. And I was just trapped in the middle of it.
What has been uncovered is that there was a network of operating in that area of East Sussex. This diocese was controlled by Peter Ball, of all people at the time. And he's an individual who we strongly suspect knew what was happening and knew that other priests in that diocese were abusing children. And he was taking no action to prevent this.
One New Year's I was taken away by Roy Cotton to see another priest who was called Colin Pritchard. I was taken to a New Year's party where I was given copious amounts of alcohol. And there were lots of men, you know, who I thought were like-minded men. And I didn't know that. But I lost consciousness at some point. I remember waking up the next day back at Colin Pritchard's vicarage. I didn't have any clothes on. I was feeling incredibly unwell and thought something terrible might have happened to me. I was terrified the night before. When I went into the kitchen, I was quite violently sexually assaulted by Colin Pritchard. I mean, to the extent I was left bleeding. And I wasn't used to that. You know, I was used to systematic, but I wasn't used to physical violence. I was 15 at this point. And I remember distinctly on the bus going back to school after that holidays, thinking I've really got to do something about this. You know, I've got to go to the police. But I didn't. And I didn't because I thought this is going to be like throwing a hand grenade into my family if this comes out. And it would be a massive scandal and it would destroy my life. But I could not believe that this could happen by accident. It was clear these knew each other and were working together.
What's especially extraordinary looking back is the fact that I couldn't have access to Peter Ball's clergy files until 4 years into the job. I was basically given the impression that it was hands-off and it was out of limits and it was something that was being dealt with at Lambeth Palace. It was a closing of ranks. Peter Ball needed not to be having this permission to officiate. He needed not to be leading services because it gives you a legitimacy of being a person who is in authority and also to be trusted. But I was told that that couldn't be changed. So I suppose at that point I felt I had no authority because I was saying things but nobody was actually wanting to do what I was suggesting, which was to stop this man. And I felt that it was absolutely crucial to put this out into an accepted professional setup. And so I wanted a professional risk assessment.
A risk assessment of a suspected will flush out any risks that they pose to vulnerable people and children. Peter Ball obviously didn't want to have one because he knew that it would show that he was a real risk.
Suggesting the professional risk assessment unleashed the full horror of a Peter Ball campaign against me. I'd be working and the next minute somebody'd say, "There's Lord somebody on the phone for you." And I'd get a rollicking down the phone about being inhumane and cruel and what did I think I was doing. From somebody I'd never heard of, some great figure in the House of Lords. I was amazed that Peter had to bring in all these bigwigs and VIPs as proof that he was somehow okay. So in fact, it had the reverse effect on me, which was that the more he was protesting and getting important people to support him, the more I actually felt this was something that absolutely had to go ahead.
I was a Sussex police officer, a detective for 20 years. I was a DS at Brighton Child Protection Team, finished as a detective inspector. When I left the police force, I became a self-employed safeguarding consultant, and I heard somebody from the church talking about how they wanted to review all their past cases, all their historic cases. And I thought, well, I I can help with this, with my background. So I wrote to Lambeth Palace. I was asked to help review all of the files at Lambeth Palace on Peter Ball. Peter Ball had been given a police caution related to an offence of gross indecency with novice monk Neil Todd. Police cautions generally are for the more minor offences, so shoplifting, minor theft, minor criminal damage. It's not often used with sexual offences. And quite quickly, I couldn't work out why he had had a police caution. It didn't make sense to me at all. It wasn't proportionate. What really struck me was finding some letters. These letters had been written to Archbishop George Carey by other victims of Peter Ball in 1992, 1993, saying that they had seen that Peter Ball was being arrested and that they wanted the Archbishop to know what had happened to them.
Dear Archbishop, my own son is my source of information as Peter's scheme for youth and was approached by the bishop on a number of occasions with unwelcome suggestions. I stripped off all my clothes and went into chapel with him to make those vows. However, Peter went further and suggested to me later that I strip off again and caress him, and he me. The Church is constantly protecting its own image and not the victims.
This wasn't just a one-off offence. It wasn't just the offence against Neil Todd. It was clear from these letters that this was a pattern of behaviour from Peter Ball, and it had gone on for many, many years. So why would it have stopped? Why would he stop offending? There was a real risk that he was still in a position to re-offend. I shared my concerns with Fiona Gardner, the safeguarding advisor in Bath and Wells, and she clearly had similar concerns.
When I read the Lambeth file, I was absolutely horrified. And I think I hadn't sort of appreciated the level of deception that I think had been going on in the church about various, until I read the details of the letters in the Lambeth file. Reading them and reading between the lines at the pain and the damage, and it was being tossed aside. And then I thought, you bastard, you know. How can you be so devious in that way? And I mean, I understand about distorted thinking, so I know that Peter Ball had compartmentalised his thoughts, but I was unprepared for the fact the church had done the same. It was absolutely imperative that that didn't carry on.
The whole ethos seemed to be to look after Peter Ball and to forget about the victims. I can't recall anything sympathetic or empathetic, kindly said in the files that I saw at that time about these men. And certainly with Neil Todd, it was even worse than that. It was accusing him of being malicious, of making all this up, of wanting money out of it. My feelings when I looked through that file was, this is a bishop in the Church of England, and he has somehow been allowed to young men over what looked like a decade, 2 decades. I just couldn't understand how that could have been allowed to happen.
Years after I suffered as a child, I was married and I had children. And my son was coming up to like age 9, 8 or 9. And this was the age when I'd first met Cotton. And so it really began to trouble me. Then one day, my brother was working with me. And there was a piece on the radio about an abusive priest in the Catholic Church. And I noticed my brother froze. And in that moment, it had never really occurred to me, or I'd never allowed myself to think about the fact that this may have also happened with my brother. And so I just asked him, I directly asked him. I said, did anything happen with you and Roy Cotton? And he didn't say a word, he just froze. He just went white, the colour drained out of him, and he just turned to an emotional wreck in front of me. And in that moment I knew, and I felt terribly guilty. I felt completely responsible. And so I went to the police.
Phil Johnson is a true hero in this story. He's the person who has been tenacious, hammering down doors, piecing bits of evidence together, proving that bishops have been lying to him. Phil was waging a campaign for justice. He wouldn't let this drop.
You would have thought that Cotton and Pritchard would have been suspended at that time, and that could have protected others. But no, the church didn't suspend either of them. I know I've spoken directly to somebody who was in that period of time. You know, that could have been avoided. The church lied about the fact that they'd spoken to the police. They said they'd shared information that they didn't. I've subsequently found out Roy Cotton had, even before he was ordained as a priest, had a criminal conviction for child. And the church knew about this. But the church hadn't shared this with the police. I was told directly by the police officer that the church just closed ranks and didn't cooperate at all. Years later, someone else came forward, another victim, complained about Colin Pritchard and Roy Cotton. It was an identical story to mine, but it was a mirror image. So it completely corroborated what I'd said. But unfortunately at that point, Roy Cotton died. And so I was kind of cheated. Eventually, Pritchard did go to trial and he pleaded guilty and got a 5-year sentence. But he did plead guilty to offences against me. When I originally reported to the police about Roy Cotton and Colin Pritchard, I also told them about my experiences with Peter Ball.
More and more people were putting together bits and pieces of a puzzle. There were more concerns being raised from other dioceses.
I was concerned that police had identified a potential link between Peter Ball and serious offenders, serious members of the clergy.
And so there was beginning to feel like a building up of information.
We reach a stage at which there are 3 individuals not happy with the situation. They are convinced that there is more activity that is yet to be uncovered. It finally seems that the storms are gathering around Peter Ball and that he is eventually going to be brought to account.
We did ask for every file held by any diocese on Peter Ball to be sent to Lambeth Palace. I thought I had seen everything. And how naive was that, because I clearly hadn't seen everything. I've been working all day looking through these files. Literally the last file that I came to, it was a report from a private investigator. I was turning the pages, sitting there on my own, thinking, I can't believe this.
These documents, they were discovered in a filing cabinet which was called the Naughty Boys Cabinet.
The Tyler report really is the smoking gun in all this. In December 1992, Eric Kemp, down in Chichester, hires Brian Tyler, a vicar and a private detective as well. George Carey knew about this. There is documentation written actually in Eric Kemp's hand, a note to George Carey telling him exactly what he was doing.
Finally, all my gut feelings, my instincts on this case were coming true. I literally felt like jumping out of my chair and punching the air in excitement, because I thought, right, this is it now. We can seriously start referring back to the police.
But what was interesting about the Tyler report is that the report begins with Reverend Tyler talking about what his instructions are to defend Peter, to dig up as much dirt as possible and discredit Peter's victims. But by the end of the report, Tyler himself has turned about completely and has concluded that Peter was guilty.
There was many graphic comments in the report about what men had said Peter Ball had done to him. Things like anointing their penis, masturbation, mutual masturbation. Brian Tyler is talking to him generally about what offences mean, so what gross indecency means. He explained that to him, and he evidently said, oh yes, I did have an omission. So it clearly shows a sexual act. You know, that is not lying together naked in the eye of God. Why didn't the proportionate thing happen? Anybody else would have been charged and on this information convicted. It was clear that senior clergy in Chichester and at Lambeth Palace knew the extent of this. And by that I mean Eric Kemp, the Bishop of Chichester, and also the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, George Carey. I met with a DI and a DS from Sussex Police. They were very receptive. They listened to me and they shared my concerns, and they agreed to take the papers away with them, and I was thrilled. That was a major breakthrough.
The Tyler report shows that there were high-ranking figures within the Church of England who were actively seeking to defend Peter Ball in those circumstances. They were seeking to try and diminish the testimony of those people who were providing evidence against Peter Ball, and were trying to minimise the circumstances that Peter Ball found himself in. The tragedy of Operation Dunhill, right from the start, was that just talking about the issues as interest in the case started to rise, that contact was inevitably made with Neil Todd. Such was the impact of those conversations with him in 2012. Before any of us had had the chance to really get to grips with what this means for his welfare, his long-term welfare. He took that tragic decision to kill himself.
half of me's gone. When you lose a sibling, you lose part of yourself. And we were close, very close. I got a phone call. Neil's taken an overdose. I basically got in touch with you and made arrangements to get out to Australia. You remember?
Yeah.
And then when I got there, it wasn't Neil. There was no one there. I'd sit with him all night. And any movement, any flutter of his eyelids, any twitch, it would give you hope. But it's just the body spasming. So I had to start making arrangements and start battling with the hospital to take him off life support. Peter Ball is responsible, categorically. The church, all his friends in high places. Neil thought he'd put it away, but you never get over anything like that. And when you try to speak out, and you go to the people that should be there to protect you, and they call you liars and mischief makers and make out that you're the one that's just stirring up a load of rubbish, and then you've got to go through the ordeal all over again.
When I discovered Neil Todd's story, we began to communicate with one another. And there were some real powerful similarities in our stories and in the way that we'd been treated. It's quite painful for me because the night Neil took an overdose, he called me. And I didn't pick up. And I didn't pick up deliberately because I was trying to stay boundaried. I was trying to look after myself. And then the following morning, I got a message to say what had happened. What Neil couldn't face was going through another police investigation. He had tried to be heard by the church. He'd been treated appallingly in 1993. He'd been through all that. And when he thought there was going to be another police investigation into Peterborough and it was all going to be dragged out all over again, he couldn't face it. That's what he couldn't face. Going through the whole thing, being questioned, being not believed, being not supported, it grinds you down. You know, I'm tired of this. You know, it gets hard fighting and fighting all the time.
Neil spent his whole life trying to be believed. The powerlessness you feel when you're up against such a cold institution of powerful men. When you know what has happened to you, things that have been so intimate and against your will. That's the thing that I believe crushed Neil.
The death of Neil Todd set the tone for the whole of Operation Dunhill. It was a painful lesson to my team and I that the term historical investigation may be fine factually, but what it really means is that the victims of such, it's never a historical investigation for them, it's something they live with each and every single day of their lives.
A lot of different people came forward from sort of different walks of life, some people within the clergy still, some people that weren't. A lot of it was in response to media reports in relation to Peter, and some were actually people that we went to see as witnesses because we'd spoken to a survivor who said I'd told them, and when we went to see them, then they would say, well, actually something happened to me as well.
A new witness came forward. A new person came forward, independent of anything within existing church knowledge, came forward directly to my team. And it meant that we had a new person who could independently of everything that had been said so far, give us their testimony about what happened, which was fantastic from my point of view, because it said, yeah, Peter Ball is worthy of investigation and needs being brought to justice. The day of the arrest of Peter Ball was probably one of the most stressful days of my life.
Excuse me, are you Peter Ball?
Yes.
I'm Detective Superintendent Carwyn Hughes with Sussex Police. Can we talk privately?
Yes. Yeah, I was just on the way to post these, but yes, of course we can talk.
Can we accompany you to your home?
There's no need. This is my home.
It would be better if we could talk at your home address.
I don't have any secrets.
Peter Ball, I'm arresting you on multiple offences of indecent assault and attempted gross indecency. You do not have to say anything, but your defence may be harmed if you do not mention, when questioned, something you may later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Bishop Ball? Bishop!
Whether I was naive or not, I don't know, but certainly it was my perception that he reacted badly. I felt that as an old, frail man, he went very limp in the back of the car, and I felt I can't take him to custody. I don't want to be responsible for, well, ultimately for his potential demise.
Stand everyone down.
I have questioned myself so much whether I was being manipulated at that time, whether he really was ill. Whilst I'm alive to the possibility that I personally was manipulated by him at that stage, I also know the medical advice says that I did the right thing.
Carwyn did say that Peter clearly was quite unwell after he was arrested, and so was de-arrested straight away.
I'm going to take you home.
We were very aware that Peter was incredibly manipulative. You know, we knew of people that said that on the one hand, he would be saying how unwell he was and, you know, could barely walk. And in their own words, in the next minute, we almost saw him skipping up the driveway. And that actually, long term, did have an impact of what happened with Operation Dunhill. It was in his best interest to say, I can't be interviewed, because A, we wouldn't be able to ask him awkward questions, and B, he wouldn't feel under the pressure of sitting there having us ask questions that he might not be able to have answers to, of going into a room and not knowing exactly what information we had before we asked him about it. We'll never know how much he was trying to play us or whether he was.
It was immensely frustrating. It felt unfair. It felt as if once again he was getting special pleading and special treatment. And this had been going on for years. You know, at every turn, excuses had been made for him, and he got away with it. And it felt like he was getting away with it again.
There was a real concern amongst victims and witnesses that there would be some form of establishment cover-up. I was conscious that Peter Ball, he had big influence in the Church of England, and we had to be very wary about who we spoke to, when we spoke to them, where their loyalties lied.
Some of the survivors felt Peter had a big support network, and that back in 1992 Peter had effectively got away with it, in their words, and that this was going to happen again, and that, you know, the establishment would close ranks.
Around September 2014, I had a telephone conversation with Sussex Police, with a detective working on Operation Dunhill. She asked me a number of questions, and if I would be willing to be a witness in court. I told her that I was very willing to assist the police with any aspect of their investigation, but I was not happy with the process, which seemed cruel and which ignored the suffering that Bishop Peter Ball had experienced since 1993. I told her then that I thought he had had enough and had committed no offences since that caution in 1993. These things should not be brought up again.
I believe Peter Ball was obsessed by his sexual predatory behaviour. I believe that this dominated his life. The caution did not change Peter Ball's behaviour. He carried on being a manipulative sexual offender.
We know that Peter offended after his caution in 1993 because we had one person come forward who wanted to report that actually Peter had offended against him and exposed himself to him.
Although in my opinion he had failed dreadfully in his actions with young men, for most of his life as a monk, clergyman, bishop, Peter Ball had served the church with great distinction as a significant leader.
I found it harder to forgive the church. I've got more angry at the church, particularly George Carey and George Carey's role in defending Peter. I can, on one hand, I think, okay, Peter's twisted. He's a sexually, psychologically twisted individual who's manipulated young people for his own ends. The thing that I find harder to understand is why somebody like George Carey and the other bishops involved in defending him consistently, over many, many years, had not a single regard or thought for Peter's victims.
A former Church of England bishop has pleaded guilty to 2 offences of indecent assault and 1 of misconduct.
It was certainly an achievement after all this time to have Peter Ball in court, having acknowledged his guilt in front of all those people, and importantly in front of the church after they were so supportive of him for a number of years after his caution, that it was publicly acknowledged that Neil Todd was telling the truth about what had happened.
In the supposed trial of Peter Ball, effectively it was a plea deal. He was charged with an offence against me, but he didn't plead guilty to that. He pled guilty to an offence of misconduct in public office. But he wouldn't admit to committing any offences against anyone under the age of 16, because that's, you know, a child sex, and that's all commonly called. And somehow, if they were older, it was okay. But Peter Ball certainly was abusive towards younger people, I know. I was there.
Even after he was convicted and went to prison, he was still looked after when he come out. Oh yes, it's fine. As long as he says, oh, I'm sorry, then they say, I forgive him. That's it. I don't forgive him. I haven't got my boy.
The independent inquiry said Prince Charles had been misguided in offering support to Ball.
The Church's response had been marked by secrecy and its apology remained unconvincing.
If you look at it from the outside, it is beautifully decorated, it has lovely stories, it promises so much, it promises everlasting life and redemption. But if you strip away the veneer, it is a cold machine. It's gunmetal coloured. As with any corporation, its whole reason for being is to maintain itself, to reproduce itself from generation to generation. It's not about love or compassion or kindness or sympathy or any human quality like that. The Church has inserted itself so firmly into society, people don't question it.
Safeguarding has moved leaps and bounds in the church, and there's now a different cultural way of thinking.
The church is trying much harder than it used to. I think it's trying to learn from its mistakes, but it's still not getting it right. I sit on the National Safeguarding Panel for the Church of England. I've tried extremely hard, but sometimes I still think they'd rather I wasn't there. They'd rather I'd go away.